We all know someone who leaves the room feeling lighter, while we remain behind feeling inexplicably heavy and depleted of all vital energy. You see them in your friend group as the one whose minor inconveniences always demand a full hour of your undivided emotional focus. They are not malicious or intentionally cruel, yet their presence feels like a slow, rhythmic siphoning of your own mental and emotional reserves. It is easy to label them as selfish or high maintenance until you realize how often you might be using others to stabilize your own internal chaos. We often mistake this energetic drain for a deep connection, unaware that we are participating in a primitive ritual of psychological survival and regulation. The popular term for this behavior, emotional vampirism, but this label is a convenient way to avoid a much deeper biological reality. What we perceive as an exhausting personality trait is actually a highly specialized survival mechanism designed to outsource internal regulation to an external source. The person who drains you is not seeking to hurt you, but is frantically attempting to avoid a total collapse of their own psychological equilibrium. From an evolutionary standpoint, a creature that cannot soothe itself must find a host who can provide the necessary emotional stability for continued survival. Most people first notice this pattern in someone close to them, perhaps a partner who cannot spend 5 minutes alone without calling for attention. This individual is not weak, but is operating on a primitive software that views isolation or emotional quiet as a direct threat to their safety. They use the conversation, the drama, or the constant need for reassurance as a way to tether themselves to the reality of another person's presence. By occupying your mental space, they ensure they are not forgotten, creating a proxy version of themselves within your mind to feel more substantial. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, and for the person who drains others, the shadow contains a profound, terrifying emptiness they cannot face alone. They fill this emptiness with your reactions, your sympathy, or even your frustration, because any strong emotion from you serves as a psychological anchor. We often frame this as a lack of boundaries, but it is more accurately described as a desperate attempt to blur the lines of the self. If they can make you feel what they feel, they are no longer alone in their suffering, effectively distributing their internal pressure across your nervous system. This behavior is adaptive because it works. It secures the attention and resources of the group, ensuring the individual is never truly socially isolated. We see this in the friend who only calls when they have a crisis, using the urgency of the moment to bypass your personal emotional defenses. Once the crisis is resolved, they go silent, leaving you with the heavy residue of a battle that was never actually yours to fight. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, as the victim of the drain begins to feel like a mere utility rather than a person. The siphoning of energy is a form of social harvesting, where one person's stability is used to patch the holes in another person's crumbling internal foundation. It is not a moral failure of the person who is draining, nor is it a sign of nobility in the person who is being drained. Both are locked in a dance of survival where the currency, attention, and the goal is the avoidance of an unbearable psychological void. We believe we are being helpful, but we are often just acting as a temporary prosthetic for someone who has not learned to stand alone. What looks like a relationship is often a parasitic loop where one person grows heavier as the other is slowly whittled away to nothing. This recognition is uncomfortable because it suggests that our most caring interactions might actually be driven by a cold, biological necessity for regulation. Staying with this uncomfortable psychological truth allows us to see the invisible cords we throw out to catch others when we start to fall. Choosing awareness over avoidance is the only way to recognize when a connection has become a covert operation for psychological harvesting. The architecture of the emotional drain begins in the early years of development, where the child first learns how to secure their caregiver's attention. If a child realizes that quiet contentment leads to being ignored, while distress or loud neediness leads to immediate engagement, a powerful lesson is formed. They learn that the only way to feel safe and visible is to create a state of emotional emergency that forces others to look at them. Psychologist John Bowlby's work on attachment theory suggests that we develop internal working models based on these early, desperate bids for reliable social connection. The person who drains others today was often the child who felt they had to be too much just to be noticed by a distracted parent. Over time, this behavioral science becomes a permanent feature of their personality, a hardwired strategy to prevent the terror of being emotionally abandoned or forgotten. Most people first notice this pattern in someone close to them, such as a sibling who was always the difficult one in the family. By remaining in a state of perpetual crisis, that child ensured the family's resources and focus were constantly directed towards stabilizing their specific, chaotic world. As adults, this individual does not know how to regulate their own nervous system because they were never given the tools to do so independently. They view other people as external regulators, much like a thermostat that they must constantly adjust to keep their own internal temperature from dropping. The survival instinct interprets a lack of external feedback as a total loss of self, leading to a frantic search for an emotional mirror. Evolutionary psychology tells us that being at the periphery of the group was a death sentence. So, we developed mechanisms to stay at the center. For the person who drains, drama is the gravity they use to pull others into their orbit, ensuring they are never left in the cold. They are not consciously choosing to be exhausting. They are simply following a script that has kept them socially alive since they were toddlers. What looks like a personality flaw is actually a fear-based adaptation to an environment that once felt indifferent or dangerously unpredictable to them. The mind learns that by leaking its anxiety onto others, the individual feels a momentary lightness that allows them to continue moving through the day. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, as the person begins to mistake the exhaustion of others for a sign of deep intimacy. They believe that if you are tired after speaking with them, it means you have truly connected, rather than realizing you have been psychologically harvested. The origin of the drain is a deep-seated belief that one's own internal resources are insufficient to handle the complexities of being an adult human. We see this in people who cannot make a single decision, from what to eat to where to live, without a committee of friends. They are outsourcing the risk of living, ensuring that if something goes wrong, the emotional cost is shared by everyone in their immediate circle. This childhood conditioning creates a person who is perpetually hungry for the presence of others, yet never feels quite full or truly satisfied. The more they take, the more they realize that the relief is temporary, leading to an even more frantic siphoning of energy from those nearby. It is a tragic loop where the very behavior used to secure connection eventually drives away the people the individual is most afraid of losing. Staying with this uncomfortable psychological truth reveals that we are often just children in adult bodies, using old tools to solve new problems. Awareness of these neurological loops is the only way to see the invisible hand that reaches out to grab others when we feel ourselves slipping. Joining a space where unspoken patterns are examined honestly allows us to look at the roots of our hunger without the need to immediately feed it. In our daily lives, the emotional drain reveals itself through a series of subtle, repetitive social maneuvers that prioritize the drainer's reality over everyone else's. You might notice a coworker who approaches your desk and begins a monologue about their personal life, completely ignoring the visible piles of work before you. They do not ask if you have time to listen. They simply begin to pour their internal weight into the space between you, expecting you to hold it. This is a form of social dominance disguised as vulnerability, where the person's perceived need grants them a temporary license to ignore your personal boundaries. Most people first notice this pattern in someone close to them, like a friend who turns every conversation back to their own specific, recurring problems. If you share a success, they immediately follow it with a struggle. If you share a sorrow, they remind you that they have suffered much more. This is a competitive form of harvesting where the individual ensures that the emotional spotlight never leaves their own internal experience for more than a second. In romantic relationships, this dynamic can be even more profound and damaging, as it often masquerades as a deep, soulful type of intense, constant connection. One partner becomes the perpetual patient, while the other is forced into the role of the perpetual nurse, always on call for the next crisis. The drainer uses their fragility as a weapon, making the other person feel guilty for having their own needs or for wanting a moment of solitude. What looks like love is actually a high-stakes power dynamic where one person's stability is sacrificed to maintain the other person's fragile sense of security. Over time, the nurse begins to feel a sense of resentment and hollowed-out exhaustion, yet they find it nearly impossible to walk away from the dependency. Psychologically, this is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, as the drainer creates a gaslighting effect where the victim feels selfish for being tired. We see this in family dynamics where one relative is the black hole of every holiday gathering, demanding that every interaction cater to their specific mood. The entire family learns to walk on eggshells, effectively giving up their own authentic expressions to avoid triggering the drainer's next emotional outburst or collapse. This behavior serves a survival purpose by ensuring the individual is never the outsider, as they are always the most discussed and considered person in the room. They have successfully engineered a social environment where they are the primary focus, regardless of whether that focus is positive or negative in its nature. Even your frustration provides them with a charge, because it proves that you are engaged with them and that they have the power to affect you. For the person who drains, an angry response is often better than no response, as silence is the ultimate threat to their precarious and unstable self-image. They use hooks in conversation-loaded questions or provocative statements to ensure you cannot simply walk away without offering some form of emotional payment or validation. What looks like a simple chat is actually a complex negotiation for your time, your empathy, and your very limited psychological energy for that specific day. The social expression of the drain is the constant, quiet theft of other people's peace to fuel a fire that can never be fully satisfied. We often play along because society teaches us that being a good friend means being an infinite resource for someone else's unending and repetitive misery. Staying with this uncomfortable psychological truth means recognizing that some people do not want to get better. They only want to be heard while staying exactly as they are. Choosing awareness over avoidance is the only way to see the hooks before they sink into your own skin, dragging you back into the familiar cycle. Modern life has created the perfect laboratory for the emotional drain to flourish, providing infinite channels for constant, low-level psychological harvesting. In the past, a person could only drain those in their immediate physical proximity, but technology has removed the geographical limits of the survival instinct. Now, the person who needs constant regulation can reach into your pocket at any hour, using the digital tether of the smartphone to bypass your peace. Social media serves as a global stage for performative vulnerability, where personal struggles are broadcast to secure a quick hit of collective validation and attention. Most people first notice this pattern in someone close to them, like a friend who posts cryptic, alarming status updates just to trigger a flood of check-in messages. This is a form of digital social engineering, where the individual uses the design of the platform to force others into a role of concerned observers. The algorithm quietly rewards this behavior because high-intensity emotional content generates more engagement, effectively monetizing the siphoning of your focus and empathy. Society has moved toward a victimhood economy, where the loudest display of distress is often granted the highest level of social status and communal resources. By rewarding the drain, we have created a culture that discourages internal regulation and instead incentivizes the public display of unresolved internal chaos. The modern workplace amplifies this through constant connectivity, where the drainer can use Slack or email to demand your cognitive energy outside of official hours. Because we are expected to be collaborative and empathetic, it becomes socially difficult to tell a coworker that their constant venting is hindering your actual performance. We are told that checking in on everyone is a moral duty, but we rarely discuss the psychological cost of being a 24/7 emotional first responder. This pressure creates a state of compassion fatigue, where we are so drained by the demands of others that we have nothing left for ourselves or our families. The survival instinct of the drainer adapts to this by becoming more sophisticated, learning to use the language of therapy and self-care to justify their demands. They might say they are holding space or sharing their truth, using clinical terms to mask a primitive need for someone else to carry their heavy burden. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, as the language of healing is weaponized to maintain a cycle of chronic and repetitive psychological dependency. Modern life also offers parasocial relationships, where people drain their own energy by obsessively following the lives of celebrities or influencers they will never meet. We have become a society of professional spectators, giving away our limited attention to people who treat our interest as a commodity to be sold. The drain is no longer just person to person. It is institutionalized, with every app and notification designed to harvest a small piece of your mental sovereignty. We are living in an era of distraction-based survival, where we use the lives and problems of others to avoid the quiet discomfort of our own existence. By focusing on the drainer, we avoid the terrifying task of looking inward and realizing how much of our own time we are throwing into a bottomless pit. The culture rewards the helper and the listener, but it rarely acknowledges that being a constant host eventually leads to a total internal collapse of the self. Staying with this uncomfortable psychological truth means seeing how modern norms have turned us all into potential targets for constant, invisible emotional harvesting. Choosing awareness over avoidance is the only way to recognize that your digital connection might just be a high-tech straw used to drink your vitality. Joining a space where unspoken patterns are examined honestly is the first step toward reclaiming the energy you didn't even realize was being taken from you. The most unsettling truth about the emotional drain is not that it happens, but that it often requires a willing participant to truly function. We complain about the person who exhausts us, yet we continue to pick up the phone, offer the advice, and provide the constant, steady validation. Deep within our own survival instinct, there is a quiet, dark satisfaction in being the one who is stronger, wiser, or more emotionally stable than another. By serving as a host for someone else's chaos, we avoid the terrifying task of looking at the unresolved emptiness within our own quiet and still hearts. Most people first notice this pattern in someone close to them, realizing that their entire identity is built on being the fixer for a broken person. If the person you are helping were to suddenly become whole and independent, you might find yourself feeling a strange sense of uselessness and social irrelevance. This reveals the parasitic nature of the dynamic. The drainer needs a source of energy, but the host needs someone to need them to feel real. There is no easy resolution to this cycle because both parties are using the interaction to hide from the same fundamental human fear of being alone. The person draining others is running from the void by projecting it onto you. You are running from the void by trying to fill it for them. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, as you realize that your generosity is often just a sophisticated way to maintain a sense of control. True awareness means acknowledging that you cannot save someone whose survival strategy is rooted in the very act of being perpetually lost and in need. As long as you provide the regulation they refuse to develop for themselves, you are participating in the stunting of their psychological and emotional growth. Yet, to stop providing that energy feels like a betrayal, triggering a sense of guilt that the survival instinct uses to keep you firmly in your place. The drainer knows this guilt well and will often use it as a final tether, making you feel responsible for their potential collapse if you walk away. There is a cold, clinical reality in realizing that some connections are not built on love, but on a mutual agreement to stay stuck together forever. We keep the drainers in our lives because they provide a constant distraction from the weight of our own unexamined lives and our own hidden fears. It is much easier to focus on a friend's repeating crisis than it is to ask yourself why your own life feels so hollow and lacking in direction. The siphoning of energy is a two-way street, where the currency of attention is traded for the comfort of never having to truly face ourselves. Ending the drain would mean facing the silence, and for many, The silence is far more frightening than the most exhausting and demanding relationship. So, we stay, becoming thinner and more tired each year, while the person we are helping remains exactly as they were when we first met them. Staying with this uncomfortable psychological truth requires us to admit that we are often the ones holding the straw for the person who is drinking. There is no advice here, only the realization that your energy is a finite resource that is being spent to maintain a lie of profound connection. Choosing awareness over avoidance is the only way to see the hooks, but seeing them does not necessarily mean you have the strength to unhook them. The quiet reflection that remains is whether you are actually the hero of the story, or simply a necessary component in someone else's survival machine.